All right, I have got Ayyaz Mallick here. Do I say Malik or Malik? It looks like a Malik, but I should say
Mallick,
Malik.
Mallick,
Malik,
Mallick.
Malik. Well, it's a king. It's a king. It's the word king in most of our language.
The Malliks from Bihar, not from Punjab. It's very important.
So here's the situation, you guys. Imran Khan has been ousted. I went on Twitter and called it a coup. I had a podcast talking about it as a coup. I suspected that I was going to get an earful from my friends from Pakistan. And as I predicted, it seems like Ayyaz, you were the one who was chosen, who's designated to talk to intervene with Justin. So Ayyaz is a friend. He's from Karachi. He's a friend of mine, long time friend from the left. Used to be in Toronto with me, but now is in the UK. Teaches in the UK. But if he's written a lot about Pakistan, about class in Pakistan, about Imran Khan specifically and Socialist Project, also studies in political economy. So if you want to look for his work there. So we're going to go over 4 issues where I state what I think, and Ayyaz is gonna, he's gonna tear me down. He's gonna shoot me down.
We have comradely disagreements.
Hopefully we'll find some areas of agreement, and then we'll see where we get before we wrap up. So first of all, the first issue to take on is why I think it was a coup. So first of all, I think it was a coup. I think if you read Killing Hope by William Bloom, or Noam Chomsky, or any of these people that track these things, there are more coups than non-coups, and in my opinion, you don't have to be a leftist to be couped, to be overthrown, although that does help. That does make it put a huge target on your back. But whether it's the Australian Labor leader Whitlam, who was overthrown in the 70s, or Diefenbaker in Canada, who was kind of regime changed by Lester Pearson in the 60s, or Noriega in Panama, there's many other examples of people who are not like socialist revolutionaries who were overthrown. And it's not always like the military comes and shoots you in your office like Allende in Chile, but it sometimes is these procedural events. So the sequence of events where the no confidence vote happens, the Supreme Court meets, the army official makes the statement, and then Imran is gone. I think it has a very coup-like flavor to it. It leaves a coup-like taste in my mouth. So Ayyaz, you don't believe it was a coup. Take it away.
Hi, Justin. So thank you so much, first of all, for inviting me to talk about the recent events in Pakistan. So look, there's no doubt that the US coups everyone. There's absolutely no doubt about it. Now, this in Pakistan, what happened was not a coup, and simply because we know how coups happen in Pakistan and what they look like. They have happened in our history 4 times before, and 5 times if you count the Ayyub Iskandar, the internal Ayyub Iskandar coup in October 58. And what happens basically in Pakistan is that the 111 Brigade of the military comes in, they depose the sitting prime minister or chief executive or whoever it is, and then the generals take over, right? Now, what happened a few days ago in Pakistan was not a coup, but what I would say is that it was a reformatting of the intra-ruling bloc arrangement, which had emerged around 2016-17, with a stepping back of the military and the intelligence agencies from its active support of Imran Khan government. And we can discuss the reasons for that later. Now, in terms of the sequence of events, I think it only looks scoopy because some of the events which you discussed in the previous podcast with the previous host were kind of incompletely narrated or insufficiently contextualized, or sometimes I felt even the previous kind of host was very economical with the facts. So, for example, let me tell you the sequence of events. Right, it was already announced in December of last year that the People's Party, one of the opposition parties, will be leading a long march against Imran Khan in March of this year. Right. In January, already major newspapers and major columnists were reporting that there is going to be a vote of no confidence presented in the parliament soon. In early February, the main opposition leader, of the opposition alliance, Fazlur Rahman, he confirmed that they are now going to bring a vote of no confidence, a motion of no confidence in the parliament. And this is all on public record. It's all reported in major newspapers. So all of this is happening much before Imran Khan's trip to Russia, which is late February, right?
Yeah. Can I just jump in only
Yeah.
to say, I think that's why I think the Afghan question has more to
Sure, we
do
can.
to play. Yeah.
Sure. Yeah, we
So,
can discuss the Afghan question in a
sure.
bit. So I'm just talking about the sequence of events in the previous 3, 4, 5 months. Now, this so-called letter, right? This so-called letter that Imran Khan keeps talking about. Now, this is not even a letter. It's an internal diplomatic cable of a report of a private meeting held between a State Department official and the departing Pakistani ambassador, which is, I think, with Majid Khan or something like that, his name was. And by all accounts, these kind of private meetings are standard practice among diplomats. Now, the person in question from the State Department side, Donald Lu, that he has used harsh words, even threatening language, I think that is without doubt, right? One, of course, is imperial hubris. That's what State Department, Pentagon people do. Two, of course, this particular person, Donald Lu, has a history of doing this, right? Has a history of using this kind of language, harsh language. For example, he's done this in his engagement with Nepal as well previously. Right, so there are reports that there were protests in Nepal as well about some infrastructure project that America and Nepal were involved in. But this cable is received in Pakistan. This internal cable is not a letter. Internal cable is received in Pakistan on March 7th. Now, as I said, the vote of no confidence arrangements much precede this. In fact, even after receiving this cable on March 7th, the Imran government ministers keep meeting and putting out joint statements with State Department officials. So, for example, they hosted State Department official, I think human rights rapporteur or something, some contradiction in terms that they usually have. They hosted this person called Azra Zia for the Islamic Organization Summit, which was happening in Islamabad around March 20th, 21st, 22nd. And they put out a joint statement at the time, right? So if they had a report about this regime change operation going on, and warned by State Department, apparently initiated by State Department officials, then why are you hosting State Department people, 2 weeks later and putting out joint communiques with them and so on and so forth, right? If Imran Khan knew about his Imran regime change operation, then why bring this up only at a public rally on March 27th, right? And why then host the State Department officials so amicably after the cable? Now, the thing is that Imran Khan, sorry, you were saying something, I cut you off.
Only that you couldn't. I think that could be explained by like fear. Like you if you think the U.S. is going to overthrow you, maybe you try to placate them a little bit and play nice. Isn't that a?
I mean, the thing is, that's why we need to look at the history of Imran Khan government and Imran Khan project a bit more, right? And Imran Khan, we know, has a history of making these kinds of false statements for mobilizing purposes and then backtracking on them later. Right. So, for example, just today, he gave a statement in the newspaper that his government went after one of the Supreme Court justices during his tenure because that justice, Supreme Court judge, was harsh of the military, and of course the military was in alliance with Imran Khan at the time. And now he's saying, "Oh, we did this. This was a mistake by us." Today he gave this statement. To post-2013 elections, he had this whole hoopla as to how 35 punctures were, inserted in the elections to make him lose. So basically, he was implying that 35 constituencies were rigged, and then he read this whole movement for 1.5 years, and then 2 years later, when the whole movement died down, collapsed, or subsided, he came out and said, "Oh no, I didn't mean that it was 35 punctures. That was just political talk." Again, this is all just on public record, right? So he has this statement of making these he has this history of making these statements just to shore up his power and shore up his kind of core base, and we can talk about that a bit later. Now, as far as his resistance to big power pressure is concerned, we know that at all moments that mattered, this government, and like others before it, it's not extraordinary in any sense, like others before it, has mostly relented, right? So the prime example is how in 2020, Imran Khan, government wanted to make this bloc, alternative Islamic bloc, with Turkey and Malaysia, right? And they were going to open up a channel against Islamophobia and so on and so forth. Again, we can discuss the merits or demerits. That's a different question. But that collapsed as soon as the Saudis displayed any displeasure. Right? As soon as they displayed a bit of annoyance, these guys just backtracked. Right? So my point is that a government with such history of just making things up, right, which can't even show resistance to Saudi Arabia on this small thing, is now expected to show resistance to US if it actually wanted Pakistan to submit on this. And we know Pakistan and Pakistan ruling bloc's history, with regards to this. So I just don't consider this a plausible scenario. Now, US pressure was there, and we can talk about this in a bit, but I just don't consider this regime change thing a plausible scenario, and maintain that, that the regime change talk of Imran is the usual Pakistani ruling class's ideological bluster in the face of an extremely limited social and economic project, right? Now that the US is not happy, right? So the question on the US is very important. So the US is not happy with Imran Khan government due to Russia's stance is absolutely true. That the military was not happy with Imran Khan with mouthing off against US and EU on this Russia-Ukraine issue is absolutely also true, right? But that does not mean, I think if you look at the sequence of events, if you look at the social class forces we're developing, this does not amount to an active American-sponsored coup. We know how coups look in Pakistan. We know how regime change looks in other places. The motion of no confidence prep, as I said earlier, had begun much, much earlier. And that is very much due to the internal shifts and alliances in Pakistan, which we can again discuss in a bit. Right. I think that being said, my final point on this coup thing is that it does not mean that the Pakistani military had no role. Right. It has made a strategic retreat from its support of Imran Khan, which was active from earlier on in the decade, earlier on 2010s, but definitely from 2017 onwards, leading up to 2018 elections. And the military has made a strategic retreat, but as usual, it has retained its final guarantor or final arbitrator role in the polity. And so what happened a few days ago, to sum it all up, was less a coup. And if parallels are to be made, it's more like the 2008 scenario when the military dictator stepped down, the Musharraf dictatorship fell, or even more importantly, the 2009 lawyers movement long march, when General Kiani, the chief of army staff at that time, eventually broke the deadlock by calling up Asif Zardari, the president at the time, and told him to restore the judges. Right. So fundamentally, I think what has happened is that the military has maintained its arbitrator role, both due to its monopoly role in Pakistan's political economy, its structural historical weight in the polity. And again, this is conditioned very much so by the limitations and the timidity of mainstream political parties in Pakistan. And these limitations, as I keep saying, are just not just subjective limitations, right? They are objective limitations. They were part of the Imran Khan government too. So to sum it all up, I think it was not a coup, but a reformatting of the ruling bloc arrangement, which emerged post-2017. Military, however, played a central role in first withdrawing its active support of Imran Khan government, which set the context for the opposition move, and then finally retaining its final arbitrator role, or what in political science language we would call the articulating principle of the ruling bloc. And I think this is kind of in a broad way, this is kind of what happened.
Okay, so I wanted to make one note, which is like the Turkey-Malaysia thing. I think that was a big deal. I think that had, it's a question of who's going to be the leader of the Muslim world and define what Islam is, in a political context. So, I just wanted to say that would also have generated considerable anger at Imran Khan from the US too, right? Because of it suits them very well to have Saudi's interpretation of Islam be the hegemonic one in the world. The other thing is, I insist that Afghanistan has a huge role in this, which is why I'm not surprised. Like, I think the Russia thing was, the last straw a little bit, but I think that Afghanistan, the support for the Taliban, whatever, like the not being apologetic about the US being swept out of there, is a reason why the US immediately would have been working towards overthrowing him from farther back than the Russia trip. So that's those are my few.
I think it's on the Afghanistan thing. I think look, it's institutional policy of the Pakistan army that they both took money from the US and supported Afghan Taliban. I think that displeasure of America and being so openly, one, of course, in my opinion, it's good riddance that America is gone. Right? There's absolutely no two ways about it. For any anti-imperialist left, it's absolutely good riddance. Khas kam jahan pak, as we call it. In terms of it's affecting Pakistani polity, I think a lot of it might have played out through internal kind of restructuring or recalculation within the Pakistan army itself. And we'll talk about this a bit later. And I think not to do as such with Imran Khan itself, but in terms of how the recalculation is happening within the military itself. That's how I think the Afghan situation played out and is playing out.
Okay, just so to see what we agree on. We agree pretty much on what happened. We agree on the fact that the military did withdraw their support of Imran Khan. And we agree that the US was unhappy with Imran Khan about Russia and about other things. But we just disagree on whether it's called a coup. So that's not bad, I'd say.
No, and what was the proximate and immediate causes?
Right.
No.
This is pretty good. Okay, I think we're moving into an even more agreement area. So this is about what Imran Khan was. So I like I said, I think the loss of favor of Imran Khan has mostly to do with foreign policy, but you have a lot of knowledge about Imran Khan and domestic policy and the ruling coalition or the coalition that supports him. So my understanding is he was favored by the army. He was the army candidate when he did win the election, but he somehow lost the favor of the army, I think largely over the Afghan question, tilting too far towards China and Russia. And again, to me, it doesn't matter that he wasn't Chavez or Evo. And when Chavez was overthrown in 2002, briefly, people said Chavez was not Salvador Allende. When Evo was overthrown, people said he wasn't Chavez. So there's always that kind of noise. It's hard to differentiate that from signal, so to speak. But my point with that is he doesn't have to be a communist to be undesirable to the US. Even a small degree of independence is enough. So tell us what Imran Khan was and why you think he lost the favor of the US.
Yeah. I mean, as I said, I think this is more to do with more endogenous factors and processes which were happening. And this is a bit of a long answer, so bear with me, right? Because to answer some of these questions, you need to understand what is the social basis of Imran Khan's party. And of course, his ascent to power is very important, the trajectory of the ascent to power, right? So very, very, very simply speaking, and I've written more about this in detail in other places, you can see that Imran Khan's core support base comes from a very post-liberalization fraction of Pakistan's urban middle classes, right? That doesn't mean he doesn't have support in other classes, but this is only a statement on his core, or what we would call a hegemonic social base, right? The core, the social group which is most organized in his party, which articulates his interest through his party and through kind of almost his person, right? Now, of course, very simply speaking, again, no one can attain power on the basis of a core middle class group only, right? So the choice that PTI Imran Khan had was one of two, right? One, you could ally with the subordinate classes or subordinate classes of Pakistan and challenge the prevailing power structure as a whole, right? That's one choice. The second choice that they had, that you ally with existing dominant groups and institutions to gain power. Now, the choice that Imran Khan and the party made was very simple. Was the second one. It's very apparent it was the second one, that they allied with the dominant groups and institutions. Now, how this happened and how this choice was conditioned by other factors has been discussed by many. As I said, you can read my other articles. But the fundamental point is that the PTI came into power on the back of cracks within the dominant ruling elite by allying and gaining support from military establishment, right? And political brokers who are sensitive to military cajoling. Right. So, for example, the same panoply of big and medium capitalists, big and medium landlords, real estate mafia, sugar mafia, which populate other parties. Right. And the 2018 elections, we know, and this was again missed in the last podcast, the 2018 elections were the worst rigged elections in Pakistan since the last actual martial law election, which was in 2002 under General Musharraf. Right. And I can categorically make this claim. And it was rigged not just on polling day, that was not as important, but more importantly, what happened in terms of pre-polling engineering. Right. And there is much evidence of this. The news reports of what was happening, the way allies and independents were cajoled and coerced to, collaborate with the PTI, the way, as I said, a critical judge of the Supreme Court was hounded, right? I mentioned this earlier, through fake cases. And then I can tell you what happened in our constituency, right? We were there. I was in Karachi. The guy who was winning until the time we went to sleep, and the results stopped coming in the night. We woke up in the morning and another guy won. The guy in the PTI guy won. And
so the Electoral Commission is sort of army.
At the time, look, the Electoral Commission is a different beast altogether. But at the time, what was happening was around 2017-18, the whole process was being very much managed by the agencies, right? At that time. And even then, of course, I mean, as even in 2002, they couldn't get a majority, but Imran Khan, or they didn't want to get a majority because maybe they wanted to keep him subservient. I mean, that's a different question. But even 2002, they couldn't get a majority for the King's Party, right, within Musharraf era, and then they had to get allies and independence. Now, so this is the kind of context of Imran Khan's social base and his path to power. Now, this so-called tilt to China, right, that Imran Khan and other friends on the anti-imperialist left have talked about, I think this is not that simple. So, for example, the discussions over the Pakistan-China leg of the BRI project, the CPEC, China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, they were initiated in the PPP government, which is about 10 years ago, and then finalized by the Sharif government, which came into power in 2013. And in fact, at the start of the Imran Bajwa regime, and I call it the Imran Bajwa regime, not Imran Khan regime, but the Imran Bajwa regime. The start of the Imran Bajwa regime, there was an actually attempt to move away or renegotiate with China, which was eventually quashed, right? And you can look this up. Abdul Razak Dawood, the financial advisor to Imran Khan, gave statements at the time, and there was a lot of consternation, right? And during this government, the CPEC projects have actually stalled or slowed down due to various reasons. There are apprehensions within Pakistan establishment over their relations with the US compared to China. There are disagreements over shares of different local fractions in the profit rent which is being generated by the investment. So, for example, the biggest project, ML1 railway line, has been stalled for a long time, and one of the big problems is that it will actually undercut the military corporation's kind of monopoly over freight transport. The military corporation works through road transport, and this is a railway project, right? Which is cheaper if you think of it rationally. And then there are apprehensions of local traders business too. So there is actually the usual balancing act which is being attempted by Pakistani ruling classes, which I'm not sure how successful they will be. But it is what my point is. It is not as simple as Iran being pro-China while others being not so. So again, we need to know the specific history and kind of moves that happened in previous regimes than just taking Imran Khan's supporters' rhetoric at face value. Right. As for the falling out with army, and this is a key point, right? This is the meat of the thing. This was inevitable, right? Even the most pliant civilian rulers in Pakistani history have eventually fallen out with the army. We have the example of Khan Junejo in the 80s. Was Zia's prime minister, eventually fell out with him. No army protege ever remains totally under their thumb forever. In this case, Imran's case, there were a few factors precipitating this process, right? So economic crisis was one factor, but not the main one. I think that sets the context. So PTI's economic policies, were very much the same kind of IMF cocktail of monetary tightening, demand compression, austerity, and liberalization, which has been followed by other parties. No difference really, right? The ruling class generally in Pakistan cannot overcome structural crisis of political economy. This has been, and you can for more, I've talked about this more detail in a book on Frantz Fanon recently, so you can read my chapter. So additionally, what distinguished Imran Khan's party was they had a very technocratic vision of politics. And again, they have similarities with previous regimes as well. But this is very much due, this technocratic vision is very much due to the social base he represents, right? So indeed, such a technocratic vision of politics is very much in line with a very marketized vision of society, which has always been peddled by IMF, World Bank, and the prescriptions of good governance and honest, clean management and so on, right? But the thing is, unfortunately, or fortunately, this is not how politics and economics work, right? So simply put, if one comes to power on the basis of reigning dominant classes, it is impossible to reform and restructure them, no matter how honest or upright the managers, right? So again, this is an issue of the social and class alliances in power in Pakistan, right? It needs a much more rooted long-term, in fact, I would say a revolutionary project of transformation than one Imran Khan or PTI followed, because they were allied with the same biggest monopoly forces in Pakistan, the military, for example, right? And we know that in Imran Khan's time, the military's penetration of the economy increased. So it has been happening since the 60s, 70s, 80s, but it accelerated exponentially almost, right? So you see the Water and Power Development Authority's chairman becomes a military guy, right? Like the Musharraf martial law era. The CPEC authority was formed, something to oversee the Chinese projects. And the guy who was put the head of it was the former military spokesperson, who it turned out had a huge franchise chain of Papa John's franchises, the pizza franchises in America, right? I mean, these are the kind of people you are dealing with, right? And then we know that, we work with labor organizing and trade union and so on. In very factories now, in the factories, employers are now hiring army officers, retired army officers, to suppress labor revolt, and this has been happening. So you can look at, there was an interview on the Jamhoor, which is a left magazine, with a Sindh Sujagi labor organizer in Karachi, and in that he narrates how army officers have even penetrated the very apparatuses of production itself. Right, so this is what was happening on the economic front. Now, another major factor of fallout with military was the Punjab provincial government. Right, so Punjab is for those friends who don't know, is the biggest province in Pakistan. It is the main seat of military power, and so they always want to keep it pacified and satisfied. And because of all the many alliances that Imran Khan made on the ascent to power, right, the chief minister candidate for Punjab was basically a compromise candidate whom no faction was happy with. There was lots of, and I mean, Tariq Ali has now written about how this candidate was also close to Imran Khan's wife, and was a front man for the corruption there in the family. And people were speculating, it's about spiritual, because Imran Khan's wife, some spiritual kind of saint kind of person. There is some kind of witch brew or something. I mean, the more prosaic explanation is that there were so many factions to deal with that this guy basically was a compromise candidate and also perhaps a front for this kind of corruption. Right. So in Punjab, we know there were at least 4 factions. Right. There was the Aleem Khan faction in the party itself, Jahangir Tareen faction in the party itself, Chaudhry Sarwar faction in the party itself, and the PMLQ party, which was an ally of the PTI. And of course, if you have chief minister from one faction, it basically angers the others. So this guy was a compromise candidate, and there was an ensuing infighting in Punjab provincial kind of apparatus, and there was a complete paralysis of the government and governance, which was a major sticking point with the military, because as I said, military always wants to keep Punjab pacified, right? Again, all of this is on record in major newspapers, the kind of bureaucratic transfers that are happening. Like they transferred like 5 IGs of Punjab police within the first 2 years, right? Same with federal secretaries and so on and so forth, right? So the Punjab thing was a big factor. Now, the biggest factor, or the most proximate factor, I think, was Imran Khan trying to get his favored candidate, which was the then ISI chief, intelligence agency chief, General Faiz Hamid, to continue in the role with a view to making him army chief later. In November 2020, in November of this year. So General Faiz and General Bajwa is the current army chief, had started developing coldness over the former. So Faiz taking an outsized credit and being very open in support of the Afghan Taliban after American defeat. Right, so Faiz, unannounced, he appeared in Kabul, and there was all that hoopla, and all this is on record. Right, now this maneuvering within the army and some of the factors which I narrated above, eventually culminated into the crisis over the transfer of General Faiz in November 2021, which is last year, end of last year, right? So basically what happened was Imran Khan wanted General Faiz to stay as ISI chief, right? While the army command under General Bajwa wanted to transfer him to Peshawar Corps, right? So there was
This is the test. Who's in charge? Who's really in charge?
This was a big fallout, right? This was a big fallout between Imran government. So tensions, disagreements are already there, Punjab, economy, and so on. And this was the culmination point, right? Eventually, of course, army command prevailed in Pakistan, as they always do. And the relationship between General Bajwa and Imran, irreparably damaged. So now it's not Bajwa Imran regime anymore, or Bajwa Imran IMF regime anymore. It's Imran IMF regime, right? So plus, as I have said, army also was definitely not happy with Imran later coming out so openly against the US and the Russia-Ukraine situation and so on. Now, the economic issue, the Punjab issue, and the army appointment issue eventually came to a head. Under new ISI chief, then the intelligence agencies withdrew from active support of Imran Khan government. Right? Now, this was doubly damaging for the government. Right? First, because PTI had no organizational base in the Punjab province, again, the central province, right? In KP province, they have a base, which is why yesterday he did a big jalsa in KP province, you can see. In Karachi, he has a more wide base, but we can talk about it later. In Punjab province, the main place, he does not have an organizational party setup. And that organizational party setup was basically that political management of the party had basically been outsourced to the agencies, to the army agencies, right? Now, when the support was gone, the way was open for opposition politicians to basically drive a wedge within an already fractious coalition, right? Both by luring PTI allies and the party's own legislators who had defected to it in the earlier election, right? Therefore, what we see, right, is that the late last year, the opposition already has announced the long march, as I told you earlier in the first instance, right? And from early 2002, again, as I mentioned earlier, reports of no confidence motion are appearing. And again, this is before Khan's visit to Russia, which is in late Feb, or the purported letter from the US. And again, has almost everything to do with the internal political economic shifts of the regime within Pakistan. Now, another factor, which is the question of why now, right? So another question, because people keep asking, oh, why now? Why after the Russia thing? Now, another factor is, I think, the upcoming military tenures appointment in November 2022, right? As we know, Imran basically wanted to make General Faiz, who's now previous ISI guy, now in the Peshawar Corps, he wants to make him the new chief of army, right? Majority army high command does not want this, as they have now got a bad name due to General Faiz, and the pressure on Imran government has increased due to economic and political failures, right? Now, especially the other political parties as well don't want Faiz to become army chief, because they think that Imran Khan wants him to become army chief because he will then help him win the 2023 elections, right? So basically, the political brokers within PTI are not happy, right, due to internal shifts, right, the economic disaster of the government. And now with the guiding hand or pressure of the army removed, they were also looking the candidates, the people who are now within PTI, the kind of electables or brokers and so on, they are now looking towards the next elections, right? And they want to throw in their lot with the other parties, because in their calculation, the PTI's electoral ticket, is now toxic, right? They will if they'll run on the PTI ticket, they will be tainted, right? So these, then I think, is this is the main kind of answer to why it happens now, right? Now this is a debate. I think this is how I'm telling you their calculation, the oppositions, right? We can have a debate as to whether they should have waited and just let him play out the elections and so on, and voted out in the elections, which he would have done. But their calculation I'm talking about, the why now question, is to do with the military appointments too, right? And this removal of military patronage at the end of last year, right? So as such, again, coming back to the point, I think what has happened now is not a coup, right? In fact, if you want to talk in those terms again, as I said, the period from 2017 onwards can be seen as a kind of undeclared martial law, right? So we had high levels of repression and censorship. The Imran Bajwa regime kind of built on the apparatus of censorship and repression, which was being put in place by previous governments, right? But then also increasing this quantitatively and qualitatively, right? I can give a lot of evidence. My own close friends were charged with treason, like during this government, right? So in this way, if you see it in this way, and looking at all these internal restructuring which are happening, and calculations which are happening, the fall of the Imran Khan government and the realignment of the army may be compared, I think, to the post 2008 situation, when General Musharraf's hybrid kind of civilian military government fell, and military had to go onto the back foot due to some of the above factors, insofar as their chosen or installed government did not work as planned, and they had to withdraw their active support, but ultimately also, maintaining their role of the final arbitrator, or, as I call it, the hegemonic or nucleus or articulating principle of the ruling bloc. And I think that's the kind of long answer to this.
Oh no, it's very good. I only want to say, you still haven't convinced me that doesn't mean it's a coup. But I have only a couple of thoughts as you were talking. One is, at the very beginning, you set this up as, you can ally with the subaltern classes and challenge the structure, or door number two, ally with the existing dominant groups and institutions to gain power. And I would just say, if you choose door number one, you will be overthrown by the US. So there's another element of, I just want to make sure we understand, and I'm sure everybody who ever takes power in the third world understands that door number one means you're gonna have a coup. So door number two means you may or may not, depending
door
on what you're doing.
Is because you are challenging the whole power structure, which in Pakistan's case is, is ultimately is given coherence by imperialism. We know this, right?
Of course.
I mean, for the people, for the friends who are listening, I wrote an article on this recently in Pakistan English newspaper, The News, where I talk about, okay, what is the actual role of imperialism in Pakistan's polity and political economy, and how that works, right? And that's basically on shoring up the power structure, and giving coherence to a very disarticulated, incoherent political economy.
Yeah.
So any kind of project which takes the first route, right?
Yeah.
The ally which will have to challenge this truth code in total.
It's the short road to getting overthrown, and you have to prepare people for sanctions. You have to prepare people for invasions potentially, and
we have to prepare for that we have to prepare the country, the people, the masses, the project for fundamentally what Samir Amin called delinking.
Yeah, exactly.
Right? We have to delink. We have to basically restructure the whole production apparatus of the country.
The only other point is, the idea of, the move of trying to appoint your own man to chief of army staff and the people you're passing over getting upset by that is pretty that anybody who wants to retain power has to do those kinds of things. You can't, whatever, you can be mad at him or not, but that just sounds like somebody who's trying to stay in power, which
but then
is
you
the
have
first
to have
rule
an alternative base. Yeah. Sorry, I cut you off.
That's all. No, that's all. But okay, I without holding you accountable for stuff that our mutual friends say, I wanted immediately to see what Asim Sajjad Akhtar, our friend, another one of our mutual friends, had to say. He kind of said, like, this doesn't have anything to do with the people of Pakistan, something like that. Like this is a inter-ruling class maneuvering that has nothing to do with the people. And I didn't agree with that, just because I kind of feel like if you could make that case about any kind of party politics or anything that goes on at the elite level, and I do think those things do have severe impacts. The other thing is, I think these demonstrations have been very big. And, if you do try to move in a more independent direction, you will get called all of these things. I think you've convinced me that he's Imran Khan's not like a raging Democrat. I don't think that's a sustainable position.
I wish it was true.
To hold.
I used to love him as a cricketer, but
yeah, that's right. We didn't talk about how good of a cricketer he is. But one of the things in your Facebook post that you said, you were saying, this Imran Khan's not an anti-imperialist because, if he was an anti-imperialist, he would have done land reform, welfare policies, concessions to the working class. But I think of those as socialism more than anti-imperialism, only because I think anti-imperialism is almost a prerequisite for socialism because of what I just said. Like, if you try to do land reform or welfare policies, you're going to be overthrown with US help. So anti-imperialism almost, it's gonna be something that comes first before a country's able to move in a more socialist direction. So tell me, do you still think this coup or this ouster, reconfiguration, conscious decoupling, do you think
decoupling, that's a good one.
that's never mind. But do you think this is irrelevant to the people of Pakistan, or is that
no? Look, of course, Asim, I think, is making a very schematic argument in the space of 750 words in his newspaper column, right? Now we can talk about Imran's support base in a bit more detail, right? And I think that will link to the question of sovereignty and imperialism in a bit, right? So as I said, Imran has a core support base, and he's very popular. That is absolutely no doubt. However, this is not a working class base, right? This is one mostly, as I said, the core is among urban, relatively affluent classes, except, as I said, in parts of Khyber Pakhtunkhwa province, right? And in Karachi, for different reasons. In Pakhtunkhwa, he has a strong on-ground party organizational structure. In Karachi, is due to different reasons, right? And we can talk about the spatial spread of Imran's class bases more if you want later. Now, however, in terms of this core group of his, right, which is in his party, in their social and ideological makeup, and there are no two ways about it, this is not a progressive social group, Justin. Their ideological inclinations have historically been very pro-military, very statist type, and very kind of, the kind of reactionary Islamic nationalist type which we've had in Pakistan, especially since the post-70s, eras. And what that has entailed, basically, if you look at their discourse, their stated positions and so on, is one, much disdain for Pakistan's ethnic peripheries, right? Pakistan's federal structure, and for those who know Pakistan's history, this is how important that is, and for Pakistan's subordinate classes, right? And I can give a lot of examples of these centralizing, reactionary, and highly authoritarian inclinations of the social group, right? So, for example, Al Jazeera, I think a year or so ago, did this documentary interview with PTI's main social media guy, Farhan Wirk. And it's on Al Jazeera. It's called, the documentary is like half an hour. It's called War, Lies, and Hashtags, right? And there, the guy says that our inspiration is Alex Jones and the American alt-right. And he says, these are his words, I'm not making it up, this is all public record. He says that we consider ourselves the Pakistani alt-right. These are the terms that he uses, right? Then in power, let's look at what happened in power. In power, during the Imran Bajwa regime, there were periodic campaigns for a presidential type system, right? And abolishment of provincial autonomy, the 18th Amendment of the Constitution. Now, there are 150 problems with parliamentary democracy, bourgeois democracy, and I can talk about that later. We can talk about that. But we know that in this context, in Pakistan's context, the cause for a presidential type system and abolishment of provincial autonomy is a highly reactionary demand. If you consider Pakistan's history with uneven development, with kind of, the separation of Bangladesh, the kind of, the problems of, geographic uneven development, political underrepresentation, and so on and so forth, and colonial and post-colonial patterns of unevenness, right? So this is a highly reactionary demand, right? Or you can look at another example of this kind of very kind of reactionary tendency or streak within this social group and Imran Khan government is, of course, the completely reactionary cultural nationalist stances adopted by Imran Khan before and after his tenure, right? So, for example, this is a guy, Justin, you won't believe that this is the guy who blamed women's clothing for rapes. I mean, this is on record. I'm not making this up. You can look it up, right? He blames Bollywood for the decline in family values. I mean, this is the guy who's on his third marriage now, right? And so on, right? All of this is in the OIC summit, like recently, last month. He kept on going as to how pornography is destroying the youth in Pakistan. I mean, not unemployment, not lack of absorptive capacity in the economy, not the fact that 40% of people in Pakistan die of diarrhea, right? It's pornography. I mean, this is the kind of thing. So this is, again, I mean, I can talk about this all, but even these protests, right? Mass protests, definitely, no doubt, lots of support. The protests are not really principled against something principled against military interference in politics. They're basically saying as to why the military is not supporting our guy, right? As it had been doing for the past 4 years, right? Why are they not supporting our guy? This is the problem. They don't have it's a very surface level understanding of society, surface level understanding of corruption, which is very much, as I said, the staple of IMF World Bank discourse and has been mobilized by right-wing populist movements all over the world, this understanding of corruption, right? Now, as for being called authoritarian or the issue of sovereignty, right? This is your second part of your question, right? I think these are abstract terms, and we have to give them content and concreteness through looking at, okay, what do these terms mean underneath their social and class, in terms of this social and class content, right? Now, as I've been implying, sovereignty in Pakistan cannot be fought for on the basis of the current configuration of dominant classes, right? And as I have said, Imran and his social base made the choice of allying the same dominant class in the military in their ascent to power. So basically, you can't fight for sovereignty with the social base, because they are too structurally dependent on imperial patronage and structurally incapable of reforming, right? So the fight for sovereignty too, in my opinion, has to therefore needs a popular and mass base, which needs organizational, programmatic, right, and mobilizational strategies, which are of a very different, radical, and I think even revolutionary character, right? The PTI, as I have said, never attempted to do this because they were never interested in it, right? It's a different project, right? As I said, the protests are mass protests. I mean, but all right-wing populists have mass support. I mean, fascists have mass support. 1,000 people gather summit, 1,000 people gather summit. That's not the revolution, right? The PTI's core base, I think, is not a progressive social group. For friends on the international left who are confused about it, it's not a progressive social group, not in their sociological makeup, not in their ideological affinities. They have historically been a pro-military group with authoritarian and even elitist streaks, right? Even I would say, and I can go out and say, with fascist streaks proto-fascist streaks, not fascist streaks. But so if there are any affinities to be made, right? Affinities, this kind of middle class core group has many affinities with the right-wing populist project in India of Modi. But, and I will emphasize this, and it's important not to misquote me on this, I don't consider Imran or his class base populists of the far right or outright fascist variety that Modi's are. Right? That's a much more deep, much more dangerous, much more reactionary project. Right? But for comparison purposes, what we can say is that it is the Modi and Bolsonaro projects, right? Or in a less extreme case, the Erdogan project in AKP Turkey, which are more congruent to Imran Khan and the PTI social basin project than the pink tide of Latin America, right? I know there were many complications, many specificities, but I think even that, for example, Brazil, right? I mean, the Workers' Party had a base in the MST, the landless movement, in the MTST, the homeless people's movement, and so on and so forth. So there was some kind of progressive social base and ideological program, which we don't have here. In fact, here, what we have, as I said, is exactly this narrow base and lack of social and ideological project, which then leads to Imran Khan and the PTI being high on rhetoric and bluster, basically ideological bluster, right? So I think the ideological rhetoric and bluster, I think, has to be seen as compensation for a fundamental weakness, right? And one which is, and in my opinion, this is not just a subjective weakness, as I said, only if they change their opinions. No. It's very much to do with the objective constitution, the material constitution of this class and social base, and how the path to power that it took, right? And the kind of ideological discourses it partakes in, which has a long history in Pakistan. As I said, Pakistani ruling classes generally have had no social economic project over the last 50 years at least, and arguably for 70 years now. And because of that, they've always had to resort to this highly reactionary type of Islamic nationalism to paper over what is basically a very shallow and weak social and economic project. And that is basically what the PTI is as well.
That's cool. My only thing is, like, with Brazil, I don't know, have you seen The Edge of Democracy, the documentary on Netflix? Check it out. It's about Brazil, and it's basically about like how Lula and more so, I guess, Dilma were overthrown in Brazil. It's made in 2019, and I'm told the Brazilian left loves this documentary too.
Okay.
But like it's basically, what a lot of what you describe actually is closer to Lula Dilma than to Bolsonaro, in the sense that while they had certain things like the Bolsa Familiar, they had like some welfare policies, they never wanted to antagonize the wealthy and the mega elite of Brazil. And so like that decision that we're never going to confront, that we're going to let them in. So they had like a representative of that group as their vice president, like Michel Temer, who basically overthrew them in the end. So it's like that Bajwa, thing you're describing. Like there is this thing of like, oh, let's let these people in and keep them close and make sure that we can, and then we'll be able to do stuff for the poor, for the masses, but without antagonizing them and without getting overthrown. And of course you can never do enough. You can never there's no amount you can do for the poor that's too little from their perspective. So I just wanted to say, like, as you were describing some of the stuff with PTI, it sounded actually, unfortunately, more like Lula Dilma than Bolsonaro.
I think, can I add very, very briefly on this? I think with the PTI, I think this is the minor disagreement between us. I think with the Lula, with the Chavez, these at some level they were anchored in, for example,
Chavez is different, because Chavez is, I think, a revolution. Like I think there is a revolutionary process.
Sure. But I think even before allying with these dominant classes, right? The PTI I'm talking about. They had a very technocratic understanding of politics, right? I think it was never a progressive project. It was a very technocratic, very top-down, very moralistic understanding of what corruption is, what economy is, what politics is, which was always going to be always going to compromise with the dominant classes. And we know this. We know ED, right? So the biggest philanthropist in Pakistan, someone whose integrity no one doubts, comes from a left background. When he was alive, there's an interview of his on YouTube. You can look it up, and he says that when Imran Khan was forming his party, the former ISI chief came to me. Imran Khan, former ISI chief, General Hamid Gul, who made millions during the Afghan jihad, and they came to me and asked me to join this party. So he has always been close to this kind of the more kind of reactionary cultural nationalist parts of the state apparatus, right? And always had this very moralistic, individualistic understanding of corruption, and technocratic understanding of politics, which I think was waiting to be co-opted, or they formed a willing alliance with these people.
Right.
And their finance minister came from the World Bank, as in previous governments. Their state bank governor comes from the IMF. The deputy state bank governor comes from the IMF. These projects of welfare and so on that PTI supporters keep talking about, they were done in previous governments as well. And they're all kind of what we call welfare neoliberalism. So handing out cash handouts to people.
What's the guy? Microfinance?
Microfinance has been happening since the 90s, right? But handing out cash handout, which is fine. I mean, of course, something is better than nothing. But in terms of social welfare, right? During the previous government, Sharif government, it was in the Punjab that education was turbo privatized through public-private partnerships, right? In Imran Khan's government, it's the health. Right, so PTI supporters talk a lot about the institutionalized health insurance, but that's basically the American model of privatizing healthcare, whereby you cut the state public sector, right, and you give everyone some kind of insurance card of 10 lakh rupees, I think it's, or 10 million rupees in this case, I think it is, and you ask them, you can go to any private hospital and do that. And basically what that is basically incentivizing the private sector to charge the state as much as possible, to charge the public sector as much as possible. And it's basically in the guise of welfare, it's the same mantra of private-public partnership neoliberalism that we've seen here, even in the UK with the NHS.
Right? And inflation, I mean, that's a driver of inflation too.
Absolutely. So we know, and again, Imran Khan was not unique in that sense. Shehbaz Sharif government did this, as I said, with the education department. Imran Khan has done this now with the health department, right? So as I said, I mean, again, this technocratic understanding, this very moralistic understanding, with this inclination towards the right, I think it has always been there. And they were always primed to form alliances with these dominant classes and dominant institutions, rather than having any kind of inclination with working with trade unions, working with feminist movements, working with student movements, and so on, or movements from the peripheries and so on. So
okay. So my last one is from your Facebook post, where you kind of said like Pakistan is always close to some kind of imperialism, whether it's, you didn't say it exactly like this, but it was something, it sounded to me like you were saying that Pakistan is either going to be under US imperialism or Chinese or Saudi, and I just I actually think you agree, but I don't really think that there are multiple imperialisms in the world today. I think the US, between dollar hegemony and the military bases and the ability to do coups and the monopolies on tech and intellectual property regimes, brain drain, and the control of the migration, there are all these things which make it only one empire. And I think Saudi is basically a colony, and I think China is, semi trying to break at the present, breaking away from a kind of a semi colony relationship, which it has been breaking away from since, I guess, 1949. So, where are you at in terms of multiple imperialism or one imperialism or whatever?
No, that's a great question. Thank you, Justin, for asking me to clarify this. No, I don't think the Saudi Arabia is imperialist. I think, as you mentioned, my Facebook post, and of course on Facebook, when you write these things, you're always writing in shorthand, and the premium is on brevity, right? So I can now explain this a bit more. So I think Saudi is not imperialist. I think if anything, I would say that Saudi is a sub-imperialist country, right, which is subordinate to the major world imperialist power. As I said, agree with you with America, the USA, but also cultivated as a regional hegemon in its own right? And I think here the theorization of sub-imperialism developed in context of Brazil by Raul Marini, and in context of pre-revolutionary Iran by Firoz Ahmad from Pakistan. I think these might be useful, these understanding of sub-imperialism, and people are now talking about Patrick Byrne has written about South Africa in this context. That might be useful in terms of Saudi Arabia, but again, I'm open to other interpretations right here. In terms of the US being the single dominant imperialist country, absolutely. It's the linchpin of the global capitalist imperial order, right? And even though it's definitely weakening, it will remain so for a long time. Right, and it's the dominant imperialist country for all the reasons you've given: dollar sovereignty, patents, control over patents, military hegemony, and so on and so forth. Intellectual regime, multinationals, controlling the commanding heights of the fire insurance, real estate sectors, and so on and so forth. Finance, insurance, real estate sectors. And we know this, right? I don't think, in terms of China, it's an interesting question. I don't think China is an imperialist country at the level of the world system, right? There are some indications now that China, while being a semi-peripheral and exploited country on the level of the overall world system, might be developing relations of unequal exchange and exploitation with parts of Africa and South Asian countries. So I'm going here on a very good recent detailed piece by Minky Lee in Monthly Review, which is a very good anti-imperialist journal, in my opinion, by Minky Lee, which basically traces patterns of investment, unequal exchange, and labor terms of trade that China has with the rest of the world and with specific parts of the world like South Asia and Africa and so on.
Yeah.
So I think
just Minchi, I think the Q is a ch sound in Chinese.
Is it? Okay, I'm so sorry.
Minchi Lee, MINQILI, and then Monthly Review. I just want people to read that because I also that was very interesting. A lot of the Monthly Review stuff on China is very detailed, very, very interesting, and highly recommended.
That was part of an issue on China.
Yeah,
that was
exactly.
that article, and that is called Semi-Imperialism on Periphery. It's a very good article.
Yeah.
It basically, as I was saying, it traces patterns of investment, unequal exchange, and labor terms of trade. And as Lee or Minchi Lee shows in the piece, like it says that as the world system stands currently, China cannot become a core imperialist country. Right, it cannot become a core imperialist country at the level of the US triad, right? US, EU, Japan. Right now, in terms of Chinese role in third world, I think that needs more situated analysis, right? And again, I'm no expert on China's relationship with the periphery, but from the little I have read, it seems to be more dependent on what kind of deal local ruling classes in particular countries can negotiate in that context, right? So in that sense, I agree with you. I think if there's a genuine left project, if there's a genuine anti-imperialist project, it would have to play on emerging poles in the world system, right? There's absolutely no doubt about that. Because as you said, the US will try to sabotage it. We know this, right? But again, as I said, all of this, with my point about sovereignty and so on, all of this depends on having a class formation, having a social coalition in power, which could actually extract concessions and in negotiations with bigger powers like China. That would be beneficial for the masses, right? And in Pakistan case, and this is not just Imran Khan, it's either Imran Khan or previous governments, right, before him, the record of making Chinese investments do much that is useful for working class and masses in Pakistan is not very good. In fact, the record is not even very good of benefiting local productive capacity and local capitalist classes, right? So you can see, for example, my friend Tayyab Safdar did his PhD at Cambridge. He's written about CPEC power projects in Pakistan and the terms of trade of the power projects. Our common friend Syed Azim also was at York with us, right? He's written about the labor practices in CPEC projects in Pakistan. So we know that Pakistan's ruling classes are so completely, incapable, structurally incapable of doing this, that they can't even benefit themselves because of this, and they are internal infighting around Chinese investment. Now, my point, so coming back to the point, so my point in that little Facebook post was not kind of an analytically rigorous definition of imperialism. As I said, on that I'm most in agreement with you. I mean, everything is agreement with you, I think. My point was more about that the Pakistani ruling classes need external benefactors and patrons to compensate for their weak social basis and lack of economic project and coherence, right? Now, those benefactors and patrons, we can call them whatever we want. We can see them as imperialist, sub-imperialist, or more prosaically as regional powers. The point is that they are structurally dependent on having an imperial patron, a foreign patron, whatever you want to call it, as compensation for a fundamental weakness, which is a social economic and objective weakness, right? As I said, this is not just a weakness or a lack of Imran Khan government. This is a lack or weakness of every government throughout Pakistan history. I think Z.A. Bhutto, Zulfikar Ali Bhutto, is the only one who arguably tried to break away from such dependency through some kind of coherent social and economic program, right? And his failure is a different matter of discussion, right? He suppressed the left, went after the ethnic minorities. Of course, religious hypocrisy started off from Bhutto era, and then of course displeased the US as well with the nuclear program. So and led the military back into politics, was eventually overthrown. So I think apart from Bhutto, arguably, this lack of social economic coherence, right, is not just a problem of Imran government, it's a problem of every government in Pakistan history, right? Again, as I keep saying, this is not just a subjective failing, right, but which can just be corrected by having an honest person in charge or well-educated experts in charge, right? But it has fundamentally to do with the class basis, the social coalitions, the economic and ideological programs, and importantly, of course, the paths taken to power, right? The alliances formed in the paths taken to power, and then how those alliances then condition the forms of rule, right? So barring having a coherent project which is rooted in Pakistan's masses, working classes, and multinational working classes. This is very important because Pakistan is a multinational country. Pakistan's multinational, any project rooted in Pakistan's multinational working classes, I think all talk of sovereignty, all this rhetoric of independence, sovereignty, this and so on, I think is just simply that, right? It's a rhetoric. It's simply kind of, I think it's talk and dissimulation for the purpose of papering over shallow and kind of almost non-existent social economic projects and strategies. This is a strategy which has been followed by the Pakistani ruling bloc forever. And we see kind of almost the pinnacle of this happening. In Urdu, we say nehaj pe pahunch jana. I don't know how to call it in English, but we see almost the kind of logical culmination of this happening with the Imran Khan of PTI project, where this taken over this kind of ideological bluster rhetoric as compensation for fundamental weakness, and it's almost become a force of its own in a sense, right? So that's what I would say.
All right. So what have we got in summary? Okay, I think
sorry for all this long-winded talk.
Mostly, yeah, it's been almost exactly an hour, so that's pretty good. I think we agree on what happened, but not about whether we're going to call it a coup, which is whatever. It is what it is. You are worried that anti-imperialists are going to get the idea that Imran Khan was a leftist or progressive, and I agree with you. He's not a leftist. That's fine. I think, though, I guess my concern is that in all this analysis, I don't want to. The reason I can't blow off the idea that he's an anti-imperialist is because primarily of the Afghan question. Now, again, you could say, that wasn't under his say that happened, but I don't think, I have a hard time believing that it is purely coincidental that it happened on his watch when it could have happened essentially any time in the past 20 years.
The US withdrawal.
Yeah.
But it was happening. It has been happening for a long time, right now.
I know, but it's yeah, sure. They've been withdrawing for as long as they've been there. But when they actually and again, if for what I'm going to be watching for, I'll say is that if there's a reopening of a drone base there, then I will feel like I know why he was overthrown. So that's what I will be watching for. And the rest I think are pretty small potatoes. Is there anything you want to make sure that anti-imperialists listening to this?
No, I think no. My only point with all of this, I think that our friends on the left in Pakistan, outside, wherever, I think we have a wonderful tool which has been provided to us to do analysis, and which is class analysis. And looking at how do economics, the social, the political, and the ideological relate to each other? How does state, society, and ideology relate to each other in all the historical specificity, right? now, of course, imperialism is part of that, but it cannot, no analysis can simply be a US-centric analysis, right? So we have to start from, okay, what are the class formations, social formations, and so on. And I think if we start from a US-centric analysis, then a lot of specificity gets missed out, right? A lot of history gets missed out, lots of rifts and shifts and torsions and tensions and contradictions get missed out, right? So we have to understand, okay, imperialism, yes, we know it's a worldwide structure, but okay, how does it instantiate itself? How does it concretize itself? Mm-hmm. How does it work in that specific context, in that specific historical structural context? And in Pakistan's case, as I said, it's not that it's a one-to-one correspondence that a State Department says something and it happens. It's more about the structural context in which Pakistan's ruling classes operate. Historically, they've operated, and the kind of tensions it generates in the polity, in the political terrain, and on the ideological terrain. And that is the kind of, instead of one-to-one determinative schemes, we need to look at this as a more, complex structural causation rather than, instrumental in a sense that one person says this and the other person just goes and does it. So, and for that, we have a wonderful tool called class analysis.
All right. I like US-centric worldviews and one-to-one correspondences, but potato. No, but that's fair, and I think that does explain a lot of why we're debating. Is that kind of question of how important nuance is, how crude U.S. control is versus how it infiltrates itself in specific situations and forms alliances with ruling classes and forces to ensure that it keeps a foothold in these places. So, yeah. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Justin.